Hey, my name is Michael Tonsmeyer, and I've been homebrewing for about 12 years now, writing the Mad Fermentationist homebrew blog for about 11. I just want to take you through one of my brew days, and honestly, not just the brew day, but the whole thing, start to finish, including fermentation, dry hopping, and all of that. I thought New England Pale Ale would be a fun batch to do, so let's get to brewing. This beer is going to end up at about 5.5% alcohol. Most of the rest will be water. So collecting water both from the hose, filtered through a carbon block filter, dilute with some distilled water. If your water tastes good, honestly, that's good enough. But if you really want to make the perfect beer, it involves crafting the perfect water. Just heating it up on a propane burner. That heat will be necessary later to activate the enzymes in the malted barley I'll be adding. Here we are crafting that water profile, adding some gypsum, some calcium chloride. These add calcium. They'll help with enzymes and yeast and protein coagulation, and we'll also add some flavors of their own. Gypsum adds sulfate, which adds crispness to the finish, to the palate, and chloride, which adds a roundness, a fullness, prevents a beer from tasting watery. Just dissolving those into the mash tun, into that water. They're both water soluble. I found water chemistry is one of the easiest ways to improve the quality of the beer. I'm using a pump here just to recirculate the water, make sure it's evenly mixed, make sure the heat is evenly distributed so I can get an accurate temperature reading on it. Time to measure out the grain. When we talk about grain for brewing, it's usually barley, and specifically malted barley. Malted just means that it's been sprouted and then kilned. Sprouting activates the enzymes. It helps to break down the proteins. It's essentially tricking the plant into thinking that it's getting ready to sprout. In this case, I'm using 75% raw two-row brewer's malt, just a bland base malt, nothing too exciting, no big toasty malty flavors, anything like that, and 25% German chit malt from Best Malt. Chit malt is just a very proteiny malt. It's been sprouted, but only just barely. And so it seemed like it would be an interesting replacement for the oats or the wheat that are often in a New England Pale Ale. To help get those grains ready for use in the mash, I'm just running them through a mill. This isn't like a flour mill. The goal isn't to break it all down to tiny little particulate. What you really want is just to crack the grains, to separate the husk material from the inner, the endosperm, the starchy part inside, to allow you to get water to mix with it, to allow those starches to be broken down into fermentable sugars. I'm using a barley crusher here. This is actually my last batch ever with this mill that I've been using for the last 5 years. The burrs, after that long, had slowly sort of worn down. It was no longer grabbing the grain like it should be to pull it through the rollers. And as a result, it was taking me a couple of times. I'd have to mill it on a very wide setting and then narrow it down and mill it again. So I recently got a new mill and happy to be saving half an hour or 45 minutes off my brew day that I was wasting dealing with this. This is actually the second of these mills that I've gone through that the same thing has happened. This one was left by a friend of mine and I've just been using it. But that's what you want to see. A mixture of large pieces of the husk and smaller bits of the endosperm. Just mixing it in now to that hot water. The hot water is about 165 degrees Fahrenheit or so, but it will cool down as the grain is added to our target temperature. Just slowly adding it, stirring as I go. Really what you want to do here is just to avoid big clumps from forming. Sometimes if you dump it in quickly and water surrounds it before it really gets mixed in, it will form dough balls, which will reduce the amount of contact with the water. It will inhibit the enzymes from being activated, and you'll end up getting less of the fermentable sugars out of the grain into your beer. While you could just let it sit, I'm starting a recirculation here. That just is going to ensure that the wort has passed through the grains a number of times, trapping any small particulate that was making it through to the area below the false bottom. Again, pump is not a necessity, but it really does smooth out the brew day, make it a lot less manual. Luckily, after recirculating, letting that temperature even out, I hit my target of 156 Fahrenheit. Sometimes I'll flip on the propane just a little bit to ensure that temperature gets maintained, particularly in the winter. Next up, another optional step, I'm taking a pH reading with my Hanna Halo pH meter. The good folks at Hanna sent me one of these to try out. The big advantage in terms of brewing is that you can take readings directly at the mash temperature. You don't have to take a sample, let it cool down, and then take a reading. You can take a reading directly in the mash tun, which certainly is time-saving and convenient. What I don't love is that it is a smartphone-enabled Bluetooth requiring device. So you need to pair it, then you need to get it connected. That saves the calibration on the phone, so if you use a different phone, it won't carry over. You risk dropping your smartphone directly into the mash tun. You have to hold it. If the probe ever breaks, you have to buy a whole new unit. There isn't just an inexpensive probe that can be replaced separately. In this case, it required a little bit of lactic acid to bring the mash pH down. I add 1 teaspoon at a time, mix it in, give it a couple of minutes to recirculate through, stir it, and then take another reading. When you're taking readings at mash temperature, you also have to subtract about 0.25 to get the equivalent reading that you would have gotten had you chilled the sample to room temperature. So after 35 minutes of the enzymes from the malted barley, the alpha and beta amylase, working on the starches to convert them into a mixture of fermentable sugars and unfermentable dextrins, the wort is just about ready to go. Rather than recirculating back into the top of the mash tun, I simply just move that over, that outlet, to the boil kettle. Once most of the wort is over in the boil kettle, once you can see the top of the grain bed, I stop the flow of wort and pour on a couple of gallons of just room temperature distilled water. Distilled water is great for this purpose because it doesn't have any carbonate in it, which would resist the drop of the pH, and so we won't extract any tannins. We won't have any trouble with harshness from over-sparging. Here's the wort slowly moving over from the mash tun to the boil kettle, going into a metal screen that I've set up to catch any of the little bits of grain that come over. That's what was caught from the full 15 gallons of wort coming over. There's the spent grain just left behind the husks and insolubles, things that we don't need in the finished beer. Slowly coming up to a boil, again on a second propane burner. You could certainly again do this on the stove, but this is a lot quicker, particularly when you're doing bigger volumes. That's more the boil we are hoping for, though. The boil concentrates the sugars by evaporating water. It kills any bacteria, any wild yeast. Just a quick reading from the refractometer, and then continuing on with the boil. 45 minutes in the boil, I'm putting my wort chiller in. This is just a copper immersion chiller. Boiling it for a few minutes to sanitize it. You can see the good hot break there, the coagulated proteins floating around that will eventually settle out. Putting that clean filter back in so I can add the hops to it and keep the hops contained from the rest of the wort so that they don't get moved into the fermenter with the wort itself. And here, first addition, 2 ounces of Simcoe going in. This will add just a little bit of bitterness, but also start building up that base of flavors with some piney tropical flavors. One of my favorite varieties. Just a pretty short boil on those. I don't want a huge amount of bitterness thanks to the large amounts of hops that are about to go in. You can see you're getting a pretty good boil there, pretty good contact between the hops and the wort. It's the concern for those screens is that if you get too many hops in there, they can really stop it from extracting well. Now that the boil's done, adding a big aroma addition. The later hops go in, the more aromatics they contribute. When I started brewing, it was popular just to add the hops right at the end of the boil and then chill as quickly as possible. But over the last few years, people have tried this hop stand or whirlpool edition to get more aromatics, to get more of those saturated flavors that you get from a nice kettle addition. Some people cool down the wort a little before they do this. I do it right at the end of the boil. I used whole Columbus because that's what I had on hand, but they are a little bit more of a hassle when using a screen like this. Just trying to stir them in, make sure they get good contact with the wort. It's one of the most important things at this stage, just to make sure that there are no clumps of hops, that there's free flow of wort into and out of the screen. I'll be running the pump just to make sure that that contact continues even when I'm not stirring them for the next half an hour or so. Half an hour elapsed. The wort has cooled a little bit on its own, but to speed things up, I'll be running just cold groundwater, cold tap water through that copper coil. Copper is a nice high heat transfer rate. Hot water coming out on the other end into the yard. If I hadn't been spending all my time taking videos, I'd probably be using that hot water to clean. With the wort mostly cooled, I pull out the screen, allowing all that great hoppy wort to flow back into the kettle. Also seems to speed up cooling, just not having that big mass of hops hanging out in there. See some nice haze, at least partly from the addition of the hops, but also that interaction with any proteins that were in there. Pretty slow whirlpool going on, but it's enough to increase the cooling rate without me having to stand out there and stir the wort. Testing the temperature down to 77. I'd like to get that under 70 if it's possible, but this was late summer and there was still a good deal of heat in the groundwater. Once chilling was complete, I allowed it to settle, allow any of that hop material that came out, any proteins to sink. Spraying my SS brew bucket stainless steel fermenter with a Star San solution. I'd cleaned it the last time I used it, so it just needed to be sanitized. That sanitized hose that had been recirculating the wort now is the outlet for the chilled, ready to ferment wort. Spraying it in there, getting some oxygen. You can see by the refractometer that the reading has gone up a little bit, meaning a little more concentrated sugar in there than before the boil. These are great on brew day. Okay, now that the wort has been fully chilled, I'm pitching my yeast that had been harvested from a previous batch, White Labs London Ale. Shaking to add a little bit more oxygen, even though you could see I'd splashed the wort into the fermenter when it came out of the boil kettle. And there we go, just a little bit under 70, chilled down nicely, and ready for fermentation. 12 hours, we're just sort of barely seeing the start of the yeast activity. 24 hours in, nice krausen starting to form. Krausen's just the yeasty head. CO2 bubbles coming out of the airlock. The airlock allows pressure out, but not the air to come back into the fermenter, keeping out infections and oxidation. On day 2, as the krausen was slowly starting to drop back down a little bit, I add the first dose of dry hops. Dry hops are just hops added to the cold side to fermentation. In this case, Citra, Simcoe, and Mosaic. Once fermentation's done, air becomes the enemy of beer, and so one of the nice things about adding hops at this stage is that you do have some protection. Normally I wouldn't take another look after that, but I just wanted to show everyone what it looked like after 12 hours once those hops have gotten in there. And then I left it for another 7 days. With fermentation done, with the hops infused and dropped down to the bottom, it was time to keg. So here I am cleaning and sanitizing a keg on a keg washer, getting the last edition of hops, the keg hops, ready. The same varieties as before, but in this case they are a concentrated form called cryo, where some of the green material has been removed, but a lot of the aromatics remain. Similar to the screen that I used in the boil, I use a stainless steel mesh tube to infuse the keg hops, weighted down with some marbles to make sure it doesn't float. I used to use new nylon knee highs. I like them because they were disposable, nice fine mesh, but it's nice to have something that's reusable and always there, and probably a lower risk that it's infusing anything you don't want into the beer. So with the hops in, with the marbles in, back on with the cap, and that just goes into the keg. I don't string it up or anything. I leave it in there from when I fill the keg until the beer is gone. Never had problems. Attaching the lid, and that's the last time that lid will be opened until I'm cleaning the keg. The keg is full of air right now and would prefer that wasn't the case, so I'm filling it with CO2, pressurizing it at about 20 psi. Each time I fill it and then release the pressure, removes about half of the air that's trapped in there, replacing it with carbon dioxide. Oxygen is about 20% of the atmosphere, so after one fill, it's down to 10%, then 5%, then 2.5%, then just about 1% oxygen. You could keep going if you wanted, but at a certain point, it's diminishing returns. You could fill the keg with sanitizer, pressurizer, and then push that out, and that would eliminate virtually all of the air that's in there, but then you'd have to open it up again to get the keg hops in there. And so I go about it this way. Next up, filling the keg. Usually I will just open up the top and siphon in, but in this case I wanted to try out taking advantage of the spigot that's built in the fermenter. Just rotating the racking arm up so it's getting fresh beer rather than down where it might be picking up the protein and yeast and hops. First I connect a short length of hose to the spigot using a butterfly hose clamp, and then I connect the other end with a quick disconnect to the liquid post of the keg. Venting the pressure so that there's a way for the beer to flow in, then opening up the valve and watching it flow in. It formed a little bit of an air bubble at first, so I turned it off and gave it a little pinch, and that fixed it. This is probably a little bit smoother than it was in real life, where after about 3 gallons it had plugged up and I had to switch back to the siphon anyway. With the beer in, time to purge the headspace, same as we purge the full keg. Just trying to reduce the oxygen that's in there to stave off oxidation. Oxygen is the mortal enemy of beer once fermentation is complete. Empty fermenter with all the yeast in the tube that was left behind. Pretty good. Something I do between every batch is to clean and then sanitize the keg lines. This removes any buildup, any unwanted yeast or microbes that may have snuck in there with the previous batch. Keeps the beer tasting a lot better. There's my homemade kegerator, just built on an old freezer. There are 5 taps, 1 for carbonated water, 1 for sour beer, 2 for clean beers, and 1 for nitro Guinness style super creamy pours. And here's the finished beer in a beautiful Sapwood Cellars glass for the brewery I'm opening. And just a little bit of foam over for effect. As you can see, that chit malt had a great effect. It's a super creamy, really substantial head. Despite all that protein from the chit malt, though, the beer actually cleared up pretty well. Most people expect this style, the New England IPA and Pale Ale, to be really hazy, cloudy, murky in some cases, and this one is actually a little bit clearer than some people prefer. So it looks pretty good. Well, let's see how it smells, how it tastes, the body, the mouthfeel. Those are really the most important attributes of a beer. The aroma has big citrusy flavors, definitely grapefruit, maybe some tropicals and passion fruit. It's relatively clean. There isn't any spice or bubblegum or estery character to it. It definitely has a little bit of that raw green hop character, probably from those keg hops. But otherwise, it certainly smells like a pale ale, like an IPA. Good body, good flavor, nice balance. Just a little bit of sweetness, but not sugary, not juicy. And a slight lingering bitterness, but it's not harsh or tannic or drying, anything like that. The head itself gives a nice little bit of boost to the body. It gives some creaminess in there. The texture, I mean, the lacing from that chit malt is fantastic. Overall, I'm very happy with it. It certainly could be a little bit fuller, a little bit sweeter, maybe 5 or 10% of a Cara or crystallized malt next time. I'm happy with the Hop Bill Simcoe Citro Mosaic, one of my favorites. Overall, a pretty good session beer, and it's the sort of beer that draws you back for another sip. The sort of beer that is so fresh and vibrant that it's almost impossible to get a commercial version. Hopefully you enjoyed watching my brewing process on this one. All the details will be available of the recipe in the associated blog post that will be linked down in the description. See you next time.